Hello, everyone. Now, this is not intended to be a particularly structured webinar. I just kind of want to go through and talk about the way the website is set up and have it as kind of a primer for anybody who's interested in this or wants to participate. And I've made it so that anybody is able to unmute, so feel free to chime in and ask questions as we go along. So let's get started. I have a quick little kind of intro slide deck, and I'll go through this and then go into Designer. And to start out with, I'll talk about the tools that are used for this. And the main thing is mostly just Designer. So it requires Designer 14 or above. I've been using 14.5 actually, and other than a couple new bugs, it's been fairly pleasant for this. As I'll get to, some of the things that come with the newer Eclipse versions are actually quite useful, but certainly 14 minimum, just because the XPages JEE support requires Domino and Notes 14 because it uses newer Java versions. So you can't get around that. You got to use 14. But for this, it's actually fine. And so along that, there's the XPages JEE support. Recent versions, so it's got to be 3 or above. I didn't mention 3 in here, but yeah, recent versions. So it uses certain specific things from Java 17 and above and the newer versions. You'll need a copy of a couple OpenNTF DBs, which as I was writing this up, I realized not just anybody can go to the OpenNTF servers and copy those down like I can. So at some point, if anybody wants to participate, drop me a line and I'll try to get you a clean enough copy, because it's not like there's a lot of secret information in there, but the project's DB is like 15 gig or something like that, so I don't want to, it's not just something I can put up on GitHub or something. But that, at least having some basic data for these things is required. And then I put a link to the GitHub page that has a little bit of setup instructions, and that has the source itself. So that's where you can go. So there's no there's no custom OSGI thing beyond the XPages JE support project. So it doesn't require an external editor. It doesn't require Maven. It doesn't require any of these structured things. Just Designer once you have the stuff installed. So I'm trying to keep it so that it's all in here, because even though it does require some plugins, I want to keep it so that it doesn't require a whole tool chain and everything beyond what a Domino developer would already have available to them. So the general structure of the NSF is that I'm trying to hew as much as possible to using NSF stuff when available. So normal design elements for images, for style sheets. I put files or JavaScript stuff in files because that way it doesn't use the terrible editor from Designer, which doesn't know about anything added to JavaScript since 2010. And so this is, I want to make use of the platform. So it's, as much as possible, it's trying to do that. There are some limits to what will show up in that normal thing. But again, I want to make this so it seems like it feels like an NSF-based application, not like developed with a whole completely unrelated tool chain, even though there are parts that significantly diverge from other ways that NSF-based apps are developed. And there are JSP elements, so there's stuff in web content. So these things, while in theory they could go in files, they make sense in here. So when we get to showing Designer, you'll see how this stuff works in action. But these JSP files are basically the same idea as XPages and custom controls. So tags are like custom controls. Views here are like XPages, sort of. And then I also have some copied in WebJars, which are, in this case, they're WebJars is a actually Maven-friendly way to house JavaScript dependencies. I'm trying to keep our JavaScript dependencies extremely minimal, but it's useful to have some. So I have some that enhance moving from page to page, but I don't want this, it's not a node-based project. It doesn't have 1,000 dependencies. There's no node modules directory. There's no build script, in part because I hate that, and also in part because that's a pain when dealing with designer-based stuff. So in general, my philosophy on this and most things lately is to sprinkle in bits of JavaScript, have a library here or there, but mostly try to use minimal code just because it's easier to maintain, ends up faster, and has some nice results. And I think it's just a good exercise. And now moving on to some of the general concepts that you'll need to know about how this is structured. So as anybody who's dealt with an XPages application goes, every single one looks different. One of the nice things about the JEE-based development is that there's some sort of general, not necessarily enforced structure, but it encourages you to have a bit of structure to it. More than you would have in XPages, where like, so sometimes people put all their logic in the XPage, sometimes they put it in custom controls, sometimes they have an XPage that only has one custom control in it, which is an idiom that is common and I don't know why. Sometimes they'll put stuff in Java, and if you're putting it in Java, do you have it all in beans? Do you have it in, you know, my old style controller classes? Do you have it in other stuff? Like, well, it's all over the place. But when you're using these frameworks, you at least have some general concepts that will be the same from app to app. And one of those is the model framework. So this uses standards called Jakarta Data and Jakarta NoSQL, which are on the much newer end of Jakarta technologies. These are, if you've used any Java model frameworks, like the various kinds that I've had or other people have had, or, you know, they're called DAOs, that sort of thing, you'll be generally familiar with the idea of having a Java class that represents an entity. So in this case, they roughly map to forms on the back end. And I'm very actively avoiding using any Lotus Domino or Domino specific APIs. So there's no, you know, there's some Lotus.Domino stuff for like name translations and things like that, and to actually find these specific databases. But as we'll see in the code, these classes don't reference document, they don't reference view. They have hints to lead to those things. But one of my general goals in development lately is not to have a bunch of Domino specific or database specific code in there, because it's faster and better to not. Oh my God, my cat. And so these classes are written with annotations to indicate backend fields. So if you've ever used JPA, which is the JDBC one, it has very similar annotations with the same kinds of names. And so this is where you define like what the ID is. So in this case, ID is the UNID of a document. So it's a string, and then you say, oh, well, you want to have a field named link ID, and it goes to permalink. So these are mapping to the old fields that have been in the database for forever. And I like to give them nice ID. I like to give them nice things in here, or nice names in Java, and then I map them to the old names. If you don't give them the column name, then it just defaults to the field name. And you'll see the repository, and it says find by subject. You'll note that there is no implementation here for that. So this is using some CDI magic in the framework that says, well, it's called find by, and then it has a field name subject, so it automatically shows it knows that you're searching for the subject field, and it kind of fills that in for you. That's one of the neat things about Jakarta Data, is that it does a lot of this stuff. And in the back end, that gets translated to a DQL query, and you can do sorting, in which case it gets turned into a QRP search. So it will do the DQL query and does QRP, and it has this view, and it does caching, and it does all this stuff very efficiently. And this is where I'm talking about why I like to not use like Lotus.Domino and other classes when I'm developing apps now, which is that all this stuff is happening, like it is accessing the NSF data, but my code doesn't have to care, which means I don't have to, for the 7 millionth time in my career, write a thing that says, that either writes a DQL query to find by subject and form equals whatever, or open the view, create view nav, go through the whole thing, like write those loops over and over and over and over again. And I like to be out of business of that because I just wrote them once in the driver. And so this is making use of that. So there's not really a lot of database access code here, even though database access is happening. And then the next big concept to know about is controller classes. So this is another Jakarta spec, another one of the newish ones, not quite as new as Jakarta Data and NoSQL, but still fairly new, called Jakarta MVC. You'll note that I'm saying controller classes here, and I've been talking about controllers for a decade or so. These are different from the controller classes from my framework from XPages, but the idea is generally the same. These are kind of are more true to the MVC ideal than the XPages ones, just because it's a different framework. These handle the endpoints and like all the stuff that is part of the app. So all of the URLs that you can get to in the application come from these. This is an action-based framework, which means that pages have no server-side state. So, with an X page, you'll have view scope, and you will make a change, and it'll do a partial refresh on that page, and it'll update data, and that doesn't happen here. Like there can be some like JavaScript and updating things on a page, like it is still HTML, but this is not XPages, and we'll get to see what that looks like when I share the share designer. This is what the actual classes look like. So if you've ever used JAX-RS, like the stuff from the extension library brought Wink, the ancient version of that. So there you have your @get and @post and @produces and things like that. It uses those annotations to build out how you access pages. So here it's saying this is the home URL. So if you just go to the root of the application, doing @get will run this method. And in this method, it does some work to read what are the most recent releases. So all the stuff that shows up on the page, this does the legwork of loading all of those and putting them into memory and then saying, okay, now render this JSP, which will put out the HTML. So the controller class does all the work. So this would be similar to if you had everything in like a before page load or one of those early hooks where you pull in all your data. This just does the work. It's all on the Java side and then hands it off to JSP. So the JSP has no like business logic in it. All it does is essentially say, okay, well, all of this stuff was populated. Now it'll loop over a thing. It'll show the labels, etc. It's very, very thin on that front. And actually, the way that MVC works is that JSP is there by default because it's part of the stack. But in theory, it could use a different front end, like any one of those other, like a Timely for any one of those other front end kind of templating pages. Like it just needs to spit out HTML. JSP does a fine job for this, but it's in theory you could plug in other ones. And this is what the JSP generally looks like. So yes, it is the same JSP from like 1998 or whenever it first came out, which means in theory you could put Java code in your JSP, but that's a terrible, terrible idea. But basically it ends up looking a lot like XPages, like it's, written with HTML and tags and, you have C:\out instead of XP:\text. And you have expression language. You'll notice that all of them are, they use $ for the binding. There is no runtime like hashtag, the # binding. That just doesn't exist in JSP because there's no runtime. Like this is all done in one pass. Like it renders out and then the server forgets that you ever requested the page. So that's nice actually, because you never have to worry about like, oh, keep pages in memory, worry about persistence, whatever. Like you do have the concept of a session scope and application scope. You do have these things, you do have beans, but pages themselves do not have any resident state on the server, which kind of keeps things clean. I think it makes a lot of sense for applications like this, where it's essentially there's a bunch of data in the database, but then it's just being presented to users. For a more complicated like line of business sort of application with a bunch of forms and complicated business logic to fill those out and things like that, things like XPages or JSF still make sense, because you do want to have something that is resident on the server and it goes back and forth and it does all these things. So like those do have a place. But for something like this, or for a blog, or a document library, or something like that, where mostly it's somebody requests a page and it shows the information, there's no reason to have a server-side state for that. And so JSP is a perfect match for that sort of application, and for this one as well. There will be some interactivity. You can, upload files, and you can make changes and things like that. Like, it is still, a full framework, but just rendering the pages and not having to worry about that state is beneficial in this case. I was trying to make the text bigger in most of the UI, but I was not successful in that. Some text got larger when I was trying, but it wasn't. So it will probably be very small for you in this. Hopefully, when it gets to a recording, if you want to look through there, or if you want to import it into your own designer, you can. The text on the actual editors is larger, so that'll be at least a little more pleasant for presentation purposes. So for applications like this, like I was talking about, I do have, things in images and files and style sheets. Most of the time when I'm working with an NSF like this, I use the Project Explorer view, which is kind of like Package Explorer, but a little nicer. It matters more when you're using upstream Eclipse, because Project Explorer has, like, if you have like a lot of working sets, you can show working sets as your top level entities and drill down from there. I still like to use it out of habit. Eclipse has had a couple different views like this, so like Package Explorer and Project Explorer and Navigator, and they've been through a couple. Project Explorer is kind of currently the favored one. I like to use it. There's a bug in 14.5 currently where you have to click on the filter and click OK for anything to show up, but once it's there, it works nicely. So I spend most of my time looking at this. I like that when I'm looking at Java stuff, the packages have a nice tree as opposed to just the big flat listing that you get for Java design elements, which, if you only have a couple Java classes, that's fine. But if you have something like this where you have many, many, many Java classes, this model breaks down pretty quickly, and you really want to have nice packages like this to organize your code. So while I'm here, I'll just start going through a couple of these classes. Again, if anybody has any specific requests, because much like with a lot of these sorts of things, because I have been mired in this sort of development for a long time now, it's easy to just make assumptions about what things are like, and it would be unfamiliar for people who haven't been mired in this. So at any point, feel free to chime in either vocally or in the questions pane, and ask any questions, ask me to go back or cover something else. So I'll start out by looking at, this is one of the model classes. So this one's a little more complicated than the one I had in the screenshot, but this is useful to show what a real model class looks like. So this is for our blog entry, which, it comes from I believe it's BlogSphere based. So it's, we've had that NSF around for a while. We've had different front ends over the years, but the data is still stored in there, and that works. There's no reason to change that. So we're still using that as the back end. So you can see the form name is content_blog entry, which, that's fine. It would be ugly as a class name, so I just call it blog entry, but content blog entry. You see I'm mapping all of these. It does do, if you have HTML like in a MIME field, or if you have a rich text field, it'll convert it to HTML, and you can store that in a string. It has support for the Java 8. So I was going to say new, but Java 8's like 15 years old or something. It has support for the java.time classes, so instant and offset date time and zoned date time and all of those things are available, and you can convert times to and from those, which is a lot more pleasant than working with either the datetime class or the Java date class, which are, ideally you would never use the Java date class anymore. So if any of you are still using Java util date, stop, unless you have any very specific reason to do so. Like if you're working with an older library or working with like a different kind of, some front end, well, I think even some JSP things still expect a date. So you can convert to it, but don't don't use that by default. Use instant, use offset date time. Instant is basically the same idea as date because it's a point in time. You can do instant.now so that's basically like a new date. So that's just the current time. So by default, if you're using date, use instant instead. It has a, let's see. Oh, you could do date dot whatever. Doesn't matter. Anyway, don't use Java date. That's just one of those things that's good to know. And anyway, back to this class, you can see also, you'll note here, it has this column $51. So here column is used as a reference basically to JPA, so column means field, but that's a holdover from using JPA where column refers to a SQL Server column. But here it means field, but also in this specific case, it's referring to a view column. So I had mentioned how by default, if you're doing a search in a repository, it'll do DQL on the back end, and it'll do QRP if you pass it as sort, and that can be nice. But even though like those like DQL and QRP and my wrappers around them do go to great lengths to try to be efficient, it's not going to be as efficient as just reading from view entries. So I have these little hint annotations that let you say, I want to read entries from a view. You can say what the max level is going to be. You can do a view query that'll let you define things like the category or find by the key, and it has to be an exact match, etc. So all of these little hints for the underlying Domino capabilities are here. And when you're reading view entries, then you can match to view columns. So this is something useful for if you have like a column that has specialized computation, like, oh, it's based on the title, or it's based on the date, or it's based on whatever. It does something special with it, and you don't want to reproduce that logic in your front end. You can read the view entry and read that in, so that it's reading from the view column, or the view entry value here. And so you end up being able to use existing stuff like that, or for efficiency, make new views. Ideally, I would have loved to not use views this much because it's just kind of nicer not to, but just the way Domino works, you need to use views for it to be fast at all, or to be at all bearable to be able to do these things. So that's where these sorts of things come in. So you do have hints, and so like much like it's still backed by documents, it can also still be backed by views, and it does these things well. So it's you can see this is still a Domino application, like it's using Domino differently, but it's still all the same stuff is there. It can store MIME, and it can store various Domino data types, and it has all these things. So it knows about these, and so it's not like a completely different, unique thing. Like the documents are stored in the same way. Like I said, this is a BlogSphere DB, so if I create documents here, you can look at them in the NSF, and they're still the same thing. So it's not like everything is like stored as weird Java objects or something like that. It is still accessing normal Domino NSF content. And yeah, so that's the general gist of how these work. So this, even though, and again, I mentioned earlier, like there's no code in here that says, doc, or like, entry.set title, and then it's doc.get item value string, etc. That is happening under the covers. Like in the driver, I am using, get item value string or get item value and get, view entry, and that's all happening. But there's no code in the application that reads from a document, that loads a document. It's all happening implicitly and fairly efficiently. So I am very, very pleased at how well that's working out. It just ends up being a much better way to do this sort of development. And then, so that's one of these general entities. So anytime you have a entity in here, so cancel. I've organized them into packages based on the database that they're from. So we have the home database, it has configuration options, it has some pages, it has alliance member, which is a list of member companies. But then you have blog, which is a different NSF, so I have a different package here. Strictly speaking, you don't need to split them up into packages like this, but that's one of the nice things about using Java classes, which is that you have packages. You can do code organization like this. So it ends up being pretty nice. And And one of the advantages of having a framework-based application like this is like, unlike, in a normal XPages application, if you wanted to find out where, if you have an XPages app and you want to say, where is the code that reads log entries? I don't know, maybe on blog.xsp, maybe it's reading a view there, maybe it's not. Maybe there's a bean that reads it, and and you have to like track down and relearn every single application from scratch every time you're looking at them. Here, well, if there's something that's reading blog entries, there's going to, I call it model, but there will be a model class somewhere and that will have at entity, and it will be reading it there. Done. Like, there's going to be a Java class for it, and it's going to be accessed via a repository interface, and that's just how it is. And it makes it a lot more predictable. So, each of my applications looks a lot more like other ones than they used to, which is that every XPages application looks different. So this is one of the nice things. It brings a lot of structure to it, and for beneficial reasons. Like, it's not a hard enforcement. It doesn't make it more difficult. It's actually easier to write code this way, and the default way you write code is something that is then explicable in the future for you or other developers, which has been a kind of a bugaboo of mine for a very long time, and this is a great way to get to that. And so next up, I'll go to the controller classes. So I mentioned how all of the actual page loading and all of the UI stuff is done via these controller classes. So if you see here, I have home controller, and so it says at path. This is a JAX-RS Jakarta REST annotation that says this will be the root. So in this context, because of how URLs work, it ends up being the nsf/xsp/app, which is the root of the application in here. And then this will be the base one. So if you go to that URL, it would say, okay, what's the root defined resource for this application? It's like, okay, it's this class. It's marked as a controller, so the MVC framework knows that it has special things that go on with rendering HTML and being more browser friendly than just a normal REST resource. And then, and I'll get to all these injecting in a little bit, but then it says, okay, well, I found this class. This is for the root path of the application. Now find the method that's annotated with get. So when you do a HTTP GET request, that you're dealing with HTTP verbs here. When you do a GET request, it will call this method, which doesn't itself have to be named GET, but that's often useful. This could be, show home. It doesn't matter. But it will say, okay, I'm doing GET, and then it's not reading any parameters, but if I wanted to, I could do query param, boo. And then in this case, it would read in, okay, well, designer's melting a little bit, so I can't do the import. But in this case, it would read in the query parameter foo, and it would be included as a parameter. You can do, if you're doing form posts, you can do at form param, you can do at header param. And so this is, again, if you've ever done JAX-RS, it's the same idea. I mean, it's the same technology. But this is nice because that way you can say, these are the query parameters I'm expecting, and they are available, and all that is there for you. But then if you don't need any, you don't need to define any. And so what this code is doing is that it has this MVC class models, which is, you can think of it kind of like request scope. There is technically a request scope in the app, but you can think of this as request scope for the page, because the job of this method is to do all of the work to read in what it needs to read in, create an environment for the page to be rendered, and then the stuff that goes into models is available on the page itself. So again, similarly, if you were using my old controller classes, or if you have a before page load or something like that, and then you read some stuff and you put it into view scope, or you put it into request scope, and then include it on the page, then this does that job. So you can see here, I'm reading the 5 most recent project releases, and here I have a bean that reads from Discord. It says get the current the scheduled events in the OpenNTF Discord, and list those. I'm comparing them by scheduled start time. Here it's reading from the Collaboration Today database. Here it's reading from the Snippets database. So it's actually reading from a bunch of different data sources here. And it's gathering all this stuff together and then getting it ready to be rendered by the home.jsp, which is the home page. So you go over here and you can see I had put in models, I had put blog entries. So now I can reference blog entries. So C for each is the equivalent of XP repeat, you end up having to get a little used to the different the different names for components. So basically everything has a different name. So it's C for each instead of XP repeat. It's C out instead of XP text. I mean, technically this came first, so it got dibs, I suppose, but you eventually learn a handful of them. There are more complicated libraries for JSP. Honestly, I've been staying away from a lot of that just because I don't want to do a lot of work in the actual page here. Like, I want this to be very simple. So, like, I want to do all the work in Java. Like, that can be very complicated. But then the page is supposed to just see that, get in and get out. So very quickly just render the stuff. This is in Designer. Designer doesn't know about JSP files, but it does know about HTML files. So part of the framework is that it binds JSP files to be opened in the HTML editor. And actually, the HTML editor has been getting better in recent releases because Designer has been using newer Eclipse, which uses Wild Web Developer, which is actually basically language server stuff. So it uses a lot of the same kind of stuff that like VS Code and things do. It's a little shakier in Designer because it's Designer and everything's shakier in Designer. But it's been getting benefits from, and I think the HTML editor does, but certainly the JavaScript editor and the CSS editor have been improving because the ones in the underlying Eclipse version have been improving. So, for example, since I just mentioned CSS, I can go find that. Make sure.
Jesse,
Yep.
there's a question. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, yeah. Good go. Sorry, I hadn't looked over it in a minute. Can you split the model into Poja bit and the repository bit? So yes. That's a reasonable question. So I have my entity class here, and then this is just kind of an idiom that I like, which is that I put the repository inside the class. You don't have to, and I used to not. So I used to structure it so that I would have like blog entry as a class and then another file that's blog entry repository. I just found that kind of doubled up. Like, I ended up having two files and looking in two places for every single entity. And because the repository tends to be very thin, and it just has like definitions of methods and some annotations, I felt like it was wasteful in that case, but you absolutely can split it out. They are still using the same framework, and so, they are still related in that way. I found this to just be a nicer way to organize it, but there's no requirement at all that you use inner classes like this for your repository. I just like to. And then, it kind of makes it look nice where here, when I'm getting a repository, I just do the entity.repository as the interface, and that works nicely. But you could put it in its own class. You could call it anything. I just like to do this. It's just a stylistic flourish, I suppose. And then, okay, so back to this. You'll see here, again, this is just using expression language, much like XPages, except it's newer, better expression language. But here I'm iterating over this, and you have post.link. This is the same idea as in XPages, where there's a method getLink, and it translates it to that. You have some JSP specific things, like here you can escape XML. So this time ago is actually a web component. So that way it uses the native browser rendering for it. So I escape the XML. And so this is like what XP text does by default, or cout does by default. You have these little functions in here. It's technically in something called JSTL, the Java standard tag library. You don't need to know too much about that in general, but it is there. And you'll see here that it starts with a T layout and T blog entry. So T is where I'm referencing tags. So like in XPages, you have your custom controls, and then at the XP view, you have the binding for the XC namespace. This is a similar idea where I'm saying load up this tag library, and the tag directory is this. So this is actually just within the application. So I have web tags, and these are effectively like custom controls. So I have this main layout one. This includes the HTML. You'll note that unlike, in XPages, you always start with the XP view. You don't write out the HTML tag, you don't write the doc type. Here, if you don't include this stuff, it doesn't exist because it's just straight going through. Like you could, in theory, have more complicated components, but just by default, JSP is just going to be basically just a text part processor. Like it is just spitting out text that happens to be HTML. And so it doesn't, it's not doing a lot for you, but honestly, you don't need it to do a lot for you a lot of the time. Like, in more complicated line of business apps, you want complicated forms and crazy controls that do a lot of stuff and have a lot of special knowledge. But for an application like this, it's actually beneficial to not have the framework do that much for you, because if you have a basic HTML file that you want to work on like outside of Designer and put in here, you can. It's lower level, but honestly, it works best here, especially as I found in a lot of cases. Browsers have so much stuff built in now that you don't need to. Like, for example, in the gallery section for screenshots, it's using the native modal dialog control that is in browsers. Like, you don't need to have like the various JavaScript frameworks with their custom modal dialogues. Like, that's just a thing that's in browsers. Like, there is a modal dialog control, and it works. And you can control it with just a little bit of JavaScript. It's built in. That means that it has affordances by default for more accessibility stuff than you would likely get in a custom version of it. And that just ends up really pleasant. Like, let the browser do the work, which is part of the goal of all this. Like, let it do the work. Like, there are certain things that browsers already know how to do. Just do that. And so that's why I've been aiming for very minimal stuff here. So like if you look at the final payload of the page in JavaScript and stuff, it's very, very minimal compared to XPages or Lord knows a node-based client single page app monstrosity. And so, but getting back to the tag here, this is written in the same, it's still JSP. It's just written in the same way. And then here you have the JSP do body. This is like in XPages and a custom control. If you have the callback, you have the default one. You can do different components if you have that sort of thing set up. So this is, again, very much like and structured like custom components in XPages. I mean, they come from the same place and same idea. So generally, this should be a very friendly experience if you're coming from XPages, because similar idea, just like a different dialect essentially. So that's I covered the models, the controllers, and then these tags. I guess there's a couple other neat things I can go through. Oh, actually, I need to talk about beans and CDI. So I glazed over this earlier. I said we'd come back to it. These @inject things. So if you're not familiar with it, CDI is basically like manage beans plus. So, in XPages, you have your faces config and you define your managed beans. You say, I want to have it be this class and it's request scoped and it has this name. And if you want to get really fancy, it has managed properties in there. Like you can set, list values and string values, although that's very rare in practice. And then over time, that concept was very useful. And so over time, JSF expanded on that and they added annotations, so you could do @manage bean on a class. And so you wouldn't have to put it in faces config, you would just have it annotated on there. And then that ended up being so useful. And also that the people working on Java EE at the time were like, well, we can spin this out. We already had, if you've ever heard of EJB, Enterprise Java Beans, that concept existed in that form for a long time too. But that is kind of onerously complicated, and it's on its way out, for better or for worse, mostly better. And CDI is the replacement. So CDI stands for Context and Dependency Injection, which is not a useful name. If you know what dependency injection is, that is a bit useful, but you can think of it as just super managed beans. So if I go to what a bean looks like, just go to, I'll do the translation bean. So a lot of this is similar to how you would do a XPages thing. So instead of having a faces config where I'm defining the bean, I just say @request scoped. Done. Now I have a bean that it gets a new instantiation per request, and that's it. technically there's some weird stuff going on. I said new instantiation, that's only kind of true. But it's, one per request. And if I go over to this other one, it's application scoped. So you have these scopes. You have application scoped, you have request scoped, you have session scoped. Technically, you have something called conversation scoped, which doesn't come into play in MVC. In newer JSF, you have at view scoped, which means the same thing as XPages does. But for now, you have your scope there, and that's nice. So just by default, you end up having this bean and its request scope there, done. So better way to do the configuration because you put it right on the class. But then you kind of get fancier stuff, which is, so you have at inject, and what this is saying is because I'm in a bean, then the framework that's giving me this bean that creates the request scoped translation bean, each request, looks through the class and says, oh, there's a field that has at inject. I'm going to check to see if I have an active HTTP request, a servlet request object, and put it in there. And it does. So it says, okay, well, there is somewhere else in the stack is something that tells it about the current request, and so it puts that in here. So you don't have to do resolve variable every single time like you do in XPages, which is nicer in a couple ways. One is that this is type safe, so it knows that I'm calling it HTTP servlet request. I'm not using the name request or servlet request or whatever. And so it only does it by type. This also means that when the application is loaded, if you say add inject for something that doesn't exist, like if I just had some class that's referencing a bean, but I didn't actually make it a bean, it would complain and it would tell me this is a problem in your code, as opposed to in XPages, if you're doing resolve variable, then what that would do is that the app would run, and then you would get to some point and you would have a null pointer exception because it just doesn't exist. And you would find your problem eventually, but you find it earlier here. But then you can also do somewhat weirder stuff. So here I have a method that says it produces a bean named translation. So what this is doing is I could have said, okay, here is a bean that's itself named translation, but this is going to be different for every request. So if I had just a class that I called translation and that itself was the thing called translation, then I would have to, in every single method, I would say, okay, well, delegate to this, but delegate to this. But here I'm saying, okay, if code requests something called translation, which if I go back to the tags, it does. So layout.tag, I have translation._lang, I have translation.copyright and things like that. It will get this resource bundle. So this can be arbitrarily complicated. A lot of the times, though, it will look like something like this. So per request, there's a method where if something says, give me the thing called translation, it will call this, and it will load this resource bundle, which if you've never done, these are the same kinds of resource bundles that XPages uses for its built-in translation capabilities, and they're very common for Java. It's this properties file format where it's just label equals whatever. And by default, if you only have this one, then it's just going to use this. But if I add translation_fr.properties and somebody with a French locale requests the page, it will load that one up instead. So this is a nice way to externalize your strings. It's extremely common in Java. It's just kind of how it's done. And so this builds on that, and this resource bundle gets that. So XPages, again, uses this. It's very common. And this is how I even though almost all of my applications end up only in English because, I speak almost only English and generally my clients only want the English one, I like having this translation file just because it would be good one day to support other languages. And I want to make sure that that's possible. And this is kind of a good way to enforce that. Again, I'm doing my beloved inner class thing. Much like with the repositories, you don't have to use interclasses for these things. I just like to. It's kind of a nice code organization thing when it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate. You can go way, way too far with this sort of thing. But my stance on a lot of things like this is that I have a level where I know it when I see it. Like when it makes sense to do, I like that. And then when it goes too far, it starts getting a bit of code smell. Admittedly, that gets a little fuzzy as far as structural rules go. but I like it, and it works in cases like this where I have a related thing that's using the resource bundle. So you can see here, it's saying, I mentioned how you could have a named resource bundle called translation, and I use it right here. So I'm saying add inject name translation. So it just says, okay, the runtime says I need to find a resource bundle that is a bean name translation, and it matches it up to this. And so that's how these things work. So when you're getting a bean, and when you have a bean, and when you want to use it in other beans, you can do things like that. So you can inject like that. If I go back to my controllers, I use that heavily. So you see here, it's injecting models. So models from the MVC framework is a bean. Project releases here is a bean. Also, if you're not familiar with the F3 shortcut, I just do F3, which brings you to the definition of the thing. So whatever your cursor is in, it takes you there. Very, very handy. Comes from Eclipse, works in Designer. It's nice. But anyway, back to here I'm saying inject this bean, and it knows project releases is a request scoped bean named projects. And I give them names because that's useful to use in JSP. You don't need a name for everything if you're only using it in Java, if it's just based on the type. I can get into the weeds on like how these things are qualifiers, and you can have different qualifiers and things like that. It's not important now. CDI is a very, very deep well to go down, and it's useful to know it's there. And so things like I've been talking about how the repositories don't have definitions for methods. So if I look at CT entries, if I go to list entries here, there is no definition for this method in here. The way that works is basically CDI magic. Technically, it's using proxy classes and runtime generated bytecode and things like that. And there's a lot of weird stuff. But the interface that you see is pleasant. And all you need to know is that, well, this is a method that has @view entries. So somewhere in the stack, it will know how to deal with that. And the one that's like find by subject, somewhere in the stack, something is parsing that method name, working on it. You don't need to worry about it. Because that, as long as it is consistent, once you know the rules, it always works. It's not like it's all guesswork. But it's, that's thanks to the CDI framework, which is that it allows the underlying implementation code to go really far. CDI also allows for things that I don't use in here, but for example, in this stack, there's also the microprofile fault tolerance, which Designer, I wasn't doing the import, but it lets you do things like saying, oh, if this method throws an exception, then fall back to another one. That's thanks to CDI, because it's actually wrapping before and after invoking the method, and you get to do really interesting, technically, I guess it would be called aspect-oriented programming things with that. Lots and lots of options. So CDI starts as manage beans but nicer, and grows greatly from there. And in this project and other JEE projects I've done, we use some of them. And fortunately, you don't generally need to go all the way down the well when you're dealing with CDI. You can, it's there, but it actually does a pretty good job of making it so that, except for very few cases, there aren't like trapdoors that you fall into, because there are a lot of frameworks, and that's always the risk of if you add too much fancy magic on top of something. There's always the risk that the abstraction will fail and you will fall into something more complicated. And fortunately, CDI and a lot of these other ones do a very good job of not sending you down there, except in edge cases. So I see, where reside the HTML files that use the Java files? What do you mean? Do you mean the JSP files that we were looking at? Because those are the ones that are in web content, and those are referenced by, so the Java controller here will say, at this path, return home.jsp, and because it's a MVC controller class, it knows that maps to something in web content, web views. That's the default idiom for where those things are. So they go in here, and then here's where you actually write out your HTML and JSP. And so this is the final level of presentation when you load up the controller method and it gets sent here. Hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise, let me know. And but these are in the NSF in web content. That's where all the HTML stuff goes. Technically, you can put these things in the file as file resources here. If you put slashes in the names, that gets a little ugly, which is why I didn't do that. But that also works as long as at runtime they have the same kind of virtual path within the NSF. So let's see, with beans, so that was covering those beans. I guess the last thing I can go over is some of the APIs that this provides and consumes. So I have these packages called API, which is just my general, for organization purposes, I use that top-level package for both foreign APIs or also APIs that it is providing. So one of them is just AtomPub. So AtomPub is a way to do blog editing with generic software. I won't go too much into this specific spec, but I use an application called Mars Edit. It's a Mac application that does blog editing, and I use that to edit my own blog, and I added classes to this so that right now when we do OpenNTF blog posts, I go through notes, which is fine, but it'll be all the nicer to be able to use a nicer application to do blog post editing. And so that's an API that this has. So in here, these are all JAX-RS resources. So much like the controllers, I say, here's the path. The base path here is /atompub/blog ID. And this is just an API I'm writing out. So JAX-RS, while like before it was used for controllers, it is meant to do REST services. And it's just kind of a general great way to do, okay, I want to have a URL that responds in a certain way and accepts certain content and certain requests. And it's great for that. And so you can do things like say roles allowed, which will then, if you're not logged in or if your user is not in this specific role, which is just a notes ACL role, then it will give you a 401 and you can log in or you can not access it. And that's just a nice thing. Like I don't have to have in all my methods saying, okay, find the current user, check the roles on the database. And obviously notes is always, your Domino has always been good about enforcing roles like this, and this is just another way of doing that. Another API, quote unquote API I have here is the RSS feed. So because it's convenient to be able to have a class that generates the RSS feed, I have this. Just a second. I have this class that emits RSS. I happen to be using. I ended up making classes that use a very old Jakarta technology called XML binding or JAX-B. Most likely, if you've done JAX-B stuff with XPages, it's probably been in the context of using that data type converter thing before the base64 class existed, or in recent versions of Domino, it's been a point of contention in some cases because the classes aren't there in the same way, or some others are there. But JAX-B is still useful in that it will bind Java classes to XML, and RSS is an XML-based language. So I just have these classes, and I have this nice Java object-y way to do this, and then it ends up spitting out the RSS. So you can see here it's using the post resource or the posts repository. It finds the most recent 10 and adds them to the RSS feed. And then I mentioned that there's both the APIs that are outgoing, so those things are provided. I have there's an API here that is useful for the members page, because one of the things that we do on the members page for OpenNTF is that because we don't want to show priority to anybody, even though in the past it was like IBM and now there's HCL, which are first among equals, I suppose. But what we do is that we randomize the list of members on the page. So the actual members page in here uses JavaScript to load this resource and then randomizes it and then displays them that way. So, it's just a nice little thing that it's like, well, we don't really want to have to worry about, alphabetical or not, or just make it random. And so I made a REST resource that just, it gives you the JSON of all of these. It's in a nice format. It has, if you want to get the logo for it, I have it so that you can get members/logo and then the name of the member, and then it will return it will load the attachment and send that back, and it has some nice things for caching so that way it doesn't have to reload it every single time. And it just ends up pleasant. And you'll note here, I'm saying I'm returning JSON, and I've blogged about this a couple of times, including recently, but I say I'm returning JSON, but nothing here is writing JSON. Like I'm returning a list of these objects, which is not, it's not a string, it's not JSON array, but this is using implicit JSON binding. So much like there's XML binding, there's JSON binding here. And so if I look at alliance member, this is just some class. It happens to be an entity class, but what happens is that when I send a list of these, the server knows that since it's supposed to be JSON, it starts a JSON array, it goes through each of these, it says, oh, there's a field called document ID, include that. There's a field called name, include that. If I wanted to, I could do JSON B ignore to skip some fields, or JSON B transient, I think. But basically, it just goes through the fields. So I think it goes, fields by default, you can have it do getters. But it just converts this to JSON in a pleasant way, and then you can customize that if you want to. And so this is just one of the other things where I'm sure we've all at some point had to write out JSON or read it in, and you just kind of don't have to that much. Like I'm doing JSON stuff all over the place, but I don't have to write out a JSON object. I don't have to use a JSON parser. It's there, and it has a technology called JSON-P for JSON processing, which is a nice JSON parser, and it has some good capabilities, but I almost never need to use it, even though I'm writing and consuming JSON constantly in these applications. That's just one of the nice things. It's because it does the mapping to Java for me. It's very, very convenient. And that comes into play when I'm talking about external APIs. So I mentioned earlier that one of the neat things that we're adding on the homepage is that it will read the list of Discord events from the OpenNTF Discord. So I have this package that's the external API for this. Discord still refers to servers as guilds because it's started as a gamer service, and I like that. And what I'm doing here is I am using the microprofile REST client to define the Discord API. So here I'm saying this is the base URL for the Discord API. And then one of the things I'm interested in is API/guilds and then / the ID of the guild, which is the unique ID for the OpenNTF server. And then I'm saying, well, there's going to be some authorization so that, I'm not going to show the tokens or anything, but this class will insert authorization for me. And when I do a get, it's going to give me JSON that will include this stuff. Here, I actually did do JSON object because I was being lazy. But when I do /schedule-events and get, it will give me JSON of these scheduled event objects. And here I'm mapping this Java class to the objects I get back from the Discord API, which means that once I read these things in, and some of them are just generic objects because they change in every request, but you can see here I'm using offset datetime, which is basically, it shows you a timestamp offset from UTC plus or minus however much. So like here it would be -5, or it's +1, whatever your time zone is, or whatever this time zone is. So that's actually in a lot of cases a good match for how Notes stores times as well. But here I'm saying, okay, well, the JSON property is guild_ID, but that's not that's not how Java writes things. We use camel case. So here I say guild ID, and then I just say the property name is this, and then it will map all these things. And if I don't include this special annotation, like for image, it will just pass it right through. So what ends up happening is I call this API, it gives me back JSON that is a JSON array of these objects that have these properties, and then the framework for me will read all those, put them into objects, and then I deal with a list of scheduled events. So if I do the call hierarchy here, designer. So if I do here, one of the things I want to do is have an ICS file for these things. But so I'm getting the list of scheduled events, and then it reads all these in, and then it just runs through them Java-wise. So here I use a for all loop. I could also use here I'm just getting the list and putting it in, and it's ready for the page. In upcoming events, it's another similar sort of thing. So I have I'm just using it as Java stuff. So like none of this here is parsing JSON. nothing is reading as a string, nothing is doing that. It's happening in the framework, and that's one of the things that in this case, the micro-profile REST client, but also the general JAX-RS thing is. So, and I know that I'm just like throwing out names of technologies like micro-profile REST client, JAX-RS. It's useful to know those, and you do learn them, but it's just kind of like these are the things that are available, and when you see them in action, see how they integrate. Like they're all meant to go together, and so it ends up being a full platform of things. Even though they've been developed at different times over the years, like some of the older ones, like the XML binding date from like 2000 or something, they've been developed over the years and they've changed, but they generally have a similar way of working, and especially now that CDI has been taken over, kind of everything settled on that as the core glue that holds everything together. So like the Jakarta data stuff with the repositories looks a lot like when you have, the way that you inject things with, you inject those into beans, and that's the same way that REST services work, and that's the same way that controllers work, and that's the same way that you can inject these remote services into your beans in the same way that you would repositories. Like it all feels of a piece, and so it's all coming together nicely there. And so, hopefully, and that's how an application like this, which is growing in complexity over time, like you think, oh, it's just a website, it's simple, but it's like, well, we have the blog, we have projects, we have listing all the different parts of projects, like the screenshots and the reviews and the releases. And then you have, we also want to add in collaboration today stuff. We want to add in Discord stuff. We want to add in X, Y, and Z, and this integration and that integration. Oh, we're going to want to do some stuff with GitHub. And so this application grows in complexity, but using these frameworks means that while the app will grow, it will grow less quickly than if I wasn't using these frameworks. So if I was just doing this in raw XPages or XPages plus a custom OSGI bundle or something, that would be doable. Like there's nothing here that couldn't be done with XPages, and strictly speaking, there's nothing here that couldn't be done if I just used legacy Domino web stuff with pages and forms. But if I was using pages and forms, it would be a freaking nightmare, and it would be completely unmaintainable. And it'd be like, oh, well, I have this little web query open thing, or I have this agent over here. It would work. You could do it. But you could also write the whole thing in C from scratch if you wanted to, but why? But having this means that, so whenever I add more models, like if I add another database, I just have another, I'd have model.someotherdb, and I would have a class, and I would know, if I want to, if I want to get a blog entry, there's going to be a class probably called blog entry. If I want to get a project, there's a class called project. And if I want to get, and I know what this is going to look like ahead of time before I even write it. And so that's how it's helping to manage the complexity, and that's why I like doing these things. And hopefully it will maintain that way, and hopefully it'll be a way that when other people are collaborating on it, we can keep things consistent in a way that and again, I keep harping on XPages and how everyone's different, but it's true. Like every single XPages application I did is completely different. I mean, not completely, but annoyingly different, just because I changed this, and it never really has XPages never really had a proper voice, whereas this framework does. A Jakarta EE app looks a lot like other Jakarta EE apps, and I think that's very beneficial, and hopefully it will maintain that. So I think that covers a lot of the main stuff I wanted to talk about. There are other little aspects to this, like I'm actually using the user bean from the extension library and providing gravatar thumbnails and stuff. These are not too important to get into right now, but there are other aspects to this application. But I really wanted to go over what makes it a JEE application and what that looks like. So I guess this would be a good time for any final questions, and also generally thank you all for joining. I've been meaning to do this for a good while, to just have a record of going over this, talking it through, having something that we'll be able to post on YouTube for future references. So it's github.com/OpenNTF/OpenNTF-home. So you can go there now, you can browse around. Like I said, it does require having some OpenNTF databases. So if you're not currently on the OpenNTF board, you are admittedly at a disadvantage for running it, but you could still look at it on GitHub. You could still import it into Designer to poke around. And I encourage you to, whether or not, and again, like I know this was structured for like if you want to contribute, but it's also, if you just want to look around and check it out, and then follow up with any questions in Discord and stuff, happy to talk about it. So I think what would make sense, if anybody does want those, ping me on Discord, and I'll try to make a copy that just includes some representative data, because like I said, it would be several gig of which is nice, I suppose, and I don't think it's secret information, but it would be a little cumbersome to get. So I can make a copy of it and trim it down to just the useful stuff if you do want to run it locally and actually kick the tires on it. All right. So and I think we can wrap it up there. So again, thank you everybody for joining. This was I'm glad I had an opportunity to finally go over this stuff. And I'm always happy to talk about this sort of thing. So I'll see you all in Discord. Bye.